Thank you very much. Thanks very much to all of you, to the university provost. Thank you very much to the Department of History, Professor Lester, for your gracious introduction and for your organization of my visit here, and to the Pauley family, of course, for their generous endowment to the university, which made this possible. I said that I would talk about the subject of loser nationalisms tonight, and that's what I'm going to do. That is, how is it that certain ways of thinking about what nations are succeed or fail? We have a tendency to think about the winners when it comes to nationalism, but I want to explore tonight, over the next little bit, the issue of what it means to fail when it comes to what nationalism is. I need to start, though, by defining what we mean by nationalism. It's a subject that has generated a huge amount of interest, especially over the last 20 years. The destruction of Yugoslavia, wars in the former Soviet Union, the existence of a new state, Eritrea, the long-running war in the Horn of Africa. A whole variety of conflicts around the world have been thought to be started by, fueled by, the product of something called nationalism. So what is it? Well, I think nationalism can best be understood as a set of propositions, and I'll just give you three of them to begin with. One is what we might call a theory of personal identity. That is, that you, each one of you, belongs to a particular nation, and you were born into that nation just like you were born into a particular family. And by nation, we don't mean citizenship, and we have to be very careful, of course, because in the American tradition, we conflate the two. We sort of ask what your nationality is. Most of us in this room, if you're American citizens, will always say, well, American. I remember when I was growing up, I really wanted to be something besides that, and so I quizzed my parents about, what are we really, beneath this sort of category of American citizenship. And they told me, well, if you go far enough back, we probably have German ancestry. Ah, that's it. I'm a German then. That's my nationality. But I'm an American citizen. The idea that you are born into a nation in the same way that you're born into a family is a very powerful concept. In fact, the very word nation, natio, to be born into something. It's part of your personal identity, and you can't escape it. It's something you can't change. Nationalism says that that's the way things are. You have an identity that you can't escape. Even if you don't realize it, you still have an identity, a national identity that you can't escape. Secondly, there's what we might call a theory of history, that the engine of historical change out in the world is the nation, and the striving of nations to be free. The striving of culturally defined national groups, people who have a common language, a common culture, perhaps a common historical memory, maybe a common religion. Their striving to be free is what history is really all about. It's not about class conflict. It's not about imperialism. It's about the striving of nations to be free, a theory of history. And then third, a theory of political legitimacy. That in instances in which state boundaries, the boundaries of countries, don't coincide with the boundaries of nations, then some kind of political conflict or other kind of either coming to blows, ethnic conflict, some sort of violence is a natural occurrence. Why did Yugoslavia break up? It's obvious. There are so many nations inside this one state. Why did the Soviet Union end in 1991? It's obvious. There are all of these nations within one state. Those are all nationalist readings of contemporary global affairs. They are nationalist readings because they rest on these three propositions: theory of personal identity, a theory of history, and a theory of political legitimacy. Well, if you look at the literature on nationalism, what you find is that most of our ways of thinking about what nations are, how we understand nationalism as a set of propositions or a set of ideas, most of our theories are based on the winners. They're based on those that succeeded. And it first occurred to me that this was probably a rather bad methodology for historians and political scientists and sociologists and others who care about nationalism and studying it. a rather bad methodology for them to pursue when I happen to be reading some of the letters of Oscar Wilde. Not the place you would normally go to study nationalism or understand nationalism, but as it turns out, Oscar Wilde traveled along the Gulf Coast in the early 1880s as part of his very famous tour through America, kind of delighting and infuriating audiences all over the United States, the great wit and playwright and writer Oscar Wilde. And in writing of this journey through along the Gulf Coast in the early 1880s, he wrote to one of his correspondents, Julia Ward Howe, "I write to you from the beautiful, passionate, ruined South," he said. He said that he had been to Savannah. He later on, then coming to the Gulf, bathed in the Gulf of Mexico, breathed in the scent of magnolias, and got up to all sorts of hijinks in that part of the country. One of his favorite bits of the journey, though, was a visit to a plantation called Beauvoir, which some of you may know. A plantation was very seriously damaged, actually, in Katrina, located between New Orleans and Mobile. His host there was somebody named Jefferson Davis, whom you may a name you may recognize, the former president of the Confederate States. Jefferson Davis was living there in obscure but easy retirement. The great conflict of the 1860s, now about 20 years past, the forgotten chief executive of a failed nation, or certainly a failed nation state, and one might also say a failed nationalism as well. It was a nation, Oscar Wilde wrote to Julia Ward Howe, quote, "living chiefly on credit and on the memory of some crushing defeat." But that, Wilde concluded, was part of Davis's charm and really part of the South's charm as well. He ended his letter to Julia Ward Howe by writing, "How fascinating all failures are." And he was right, of course. If we look at the literature on nationalism itself, there's a very famous line from probably the greatest modern theorist of nationalism, the sociologist Ernest Gellner, who died just a few years ago, where he observed that the class of failed nationalisms is actually far larger than the class of successful ones. The nationalisms that never managed to make a state, the nation makers to whom no one ever listens, the voices that are literally crying in the wilderness, trying to get people to band together around the idea of a common nationality, end up being just sort of curiosities. We don't pay much attention to them. They're the ones that lose out to alternative, more powerful visions of what the nation is. In some instances, people just don't think of the nation as a powerful pole of allegiance. They think of their family, or their clan, or their village, or their region, or their valley, or their mountainside as the basic source of their identity, not the nation at large. So I began wondering, what are the boundaries then of failure? What does failure mean? What are the boundaries of contingency when it comes to understanding what nationalism is? Why do some nationalisms endure and other ones fade away? Why do some of them become states eventually that get flags at the United Nations and so on, while others become the kind of obsessions of antiquarians and emigres and exiles and old men who keep talking about, well, when my nation was great, and no one can remember what nation that was. Why does that happen? And what would it mean to study the kind of failed nationalism that Wilde himself encountered in what he called the passionate, ruined South? Well, virtually the entirety of the way that we think about what nationalism is, and the literature on nationalism written by historians and by sociologists and political scientists and so on, virtually all of it is based on studying a limited number of cases of winner nationalisms. Britain, France, occasionally Ireland, Russia, Italy, Germany, a very limited set of cases, and often a limited set of European cases too. What I'd like to do this evening then, in the time that we have, is to discuss very briefly some of the literatures on nationalism and how we might think about what failed nationalism entails. Then I want to take you on a very quick and breezy tour through three nationalisms that might be said to have failed in various ways. And then from those three cases, to try to offer some lessons about how those cases might deepen our understanding of nationalism as an idea or set of ideas, or nationalism as a movement, and then nationalism finally as a source of social solidarity. First of all, on the literatures of nationalism. Writing about nationalism is, in the academic profession, something of a cottage industry these days. There is a vast, vast literature on something called nationalism. The writings of Ernst Renan and Hugh Seton Watson from almost a century ago in some instances, sociological approaches of people named Carl Deutsch and Ernest Gellner, whom I mentioned earlier, Anthony Smith, Rogers Brubaker, Eric Hobsbawm, Leah Greenfield. I'm naming just a few of the major theorists whom many of you will be familiar with. And then perhaps most importantly, a fellow named Benedict Anderson, who wrote a book called Imagined Communities. As with most great books, you don't have to read much beyond the title to get the basic idea, which is to say that the nation is something called an imagined community. That is, most of us will never meet all of the people who are allegedly members of our own nation, but yet we feel a sense of connection to them, allegiance to the things that they believe in, a sense of commonality with them. We imagine ourselves to be in the same community as all Serbs, if we happen to be a member of the Serb nation, or all Poles, if we happen to be a member of the Polish nation, and so on. So that nationalism today is not really a single subject of study, but it's a kind of big shelf mark in the library. It's something like democracy or Argentina. It's sort of not one kind of set of propositions or contending theories. It's just a place where you put books on the shelf, not very few of which actually speak to each other, or very few of which are sort of connected in a theoretical way. But what these literatures do have in common is that they base, as I said earlier, their views of what nationalism is and how it works on the winners. If we go back to one of the great classics in the field of the study of nationalism, a book by Hans Kohn from 1956, a book called The Idea of Nationalism. A really wonderful book, still I think relevant today, but if you look at the individual chapters in that book, well, there are chapters about the English and the Irish and the Italians and the Poles and the Germans and the Hungarians and so on, all of the nation states which end up populating the world in the middle of the 20th century. Kohn has sort of looked around at all of the successful nationalisms in his day and has then written a book based on all of the winners. Why is this not a particularly good way of proceeding? Well, the basic reason is that, if I can put on my political science hat for a moment, it's what political scientists call choosing your cases on the dependent variable. That is to say, you choose instances to study in which the thing that you're trying to study has occurred. Any social scientist will tell you that's not particularly good methodology. If you have a certain set of hypotheses about why nationalism succeeds, and you'd want to pick some cases to study where it hasn't succeeded. It gives you some kind of explanatory bite, in other words. Yet, virtually all of our theorizing is based not on a mixture of success and failure, but on only the successful cases. Now, studying the failures, though, is not at all an easy thing. Every successful nationalism is alike, we might say, but unsuccessful nationalisms fail in their own way. Successful nationalist ideologies, what do they have? Well, they garner widespread appeal among their target populations. Everybody who's a member of the Polish nation feels a sense of allegiance to something called the Polish nation. These nationalist movements transform those ideologies into the accoutrements of nationhood and statehood. They get flags and national anthems and eventually a seat at the United Nations. Most importantly, they get their statehood recognized by some international body. Other states in the international system recognize these nation states as real, legitimate nation states, send diplomats to them, engage in trade with them, negotiate with them in major international fora. That's what the successful ones end up doing. Failed nationalisms is, I think, part of that class of nationalisms that fail to achieve perhaps any one of these criteria. Appeal, on the one hand, making a state, secondly, And then third, getting that state recognized somehow in the international system. You can imagine a form of nationalism that would have really no appeal at all, but through some historical accident, wind up getting a state. That's an odd, perhaps kind of failed nationalism in a way. People don't really believe in the idea of nationhood. They don't feel a sense of commonality, but an imperial power or the international community decides that this group ought to have its own state. So it ends up with a nation state, but not much of a sense of nationality to inhabit that nation state. You can imagine another kind of nationalism that might have popular appeal and build all the accoutrements of statehood. They have a government, and they have elections, and they have a flag, and they have an army, and they engage in trade, but nobody ever recognizes them. Nobody ever recognizes them in the international community as a legitimate player. There's also a kind of failed nationalism that may be the kind of most fun to study, but probably the least relevant to study, and that's the kind of nationalism that is based on simply the desires and aims and quixotic programs of a few odd intellectuals who write a dictionary for some national language that no one really speaks, or design a flag for some nationality that nobody really cares about. And there are those people in the world, and they're sort of interesting to study historically, but that's probably the smallest class of failed nationalisms out there. So there are a whole different variety of ways in which nationalism can fail in terms of generating appeal, building a state, and then getting that state recognized in the international system. One of the problems with studying failure, though, is that it really depends on when you slice or how you slice into the historical narrative. Hungarian nationalism, for example. Terrible failure in 1848, a little more of a success in 1867, kind of a failure in 1920, big success today. Independent Hungary, member of the European Union. Great success today, but a failure at different points in its history. Croatian nationalism. Mitigated success in 1868, qualified failure in 1918, qualified success in 1941, failure in 1945, resounding success in 1991. Scottish nationalism or Flemish nationalism. Failures in the 1710s and the 1830s, respectively. But both of those, Scottish nationalism and Flemish nationalism, if they turn out to get their own states, which I think is not unlikely in the next few years in the case of Flemish nationalism, or the next decade in the case of Scottish nationalism, we might think of them as great successful nationalisms if they end up getting this other piece of the success puzzle that I mentioned just a few moments ago. We thus have, I think, when we're thinking about what nations are and how we study nationalism, there's the terrible problem of what historians will call presentism. The tendency to see the world as we have it arrayed before us today as the only possible world. Studying failed nationalism asks us to imagine a world in which things were different, in which the nationalisms we see before us perhaps were not so successful, or to cast our minds back to a time when the nationalisms and the flags and the national anthems and so on we see before us might not have been as successful as they appear today. Well, as I mentioned, there are a number of different ways of thinking about what failed nationalism is, and a number of different criteria for what counts as a failure. And it often depends on when you slice into the historical narrative, what you put in the success column and what you put in the failure column. But I want to spend a little time trying to focus in more detail on a few actual cases, and to see if we, by looking at particular cases of what we might understand as failure, can actually help us come to a more nuanced understanding of what nationalism as a whole is. So I'm going to take you on a very brief and a very breezy journey through three failed nationalisms, but nationalisms that failed in sometimes bizarre and sometimes unpredictable ways. So our journey over the next few minutes is going to take us from the familiar to the exotic, from the American South to Scotland to a place called Circassia, which is located in the northwestern bit of the Caucasus Mountains, or southern Russia, what is today southern Russia, along the northeastern coast of the Black Sea. We're going to go through some regions of mountains and plains and hollers and glens and gorges and uplands and lowlands and so on, and try to figure out what nationalism means and meant in all of these contexts. Contexts where pockets of nationalist sentiment continue to exist even after the grandest schemes for making modern nations in these places fell by the wayside. So what I hope we'll have at the end is not some magical formula for predicting where nationalism succeeds and where it fails, but a more nuanced understanding of what failure might actually mean. So let's start with the Confederates. The failure of the Confederate States of America has a long and venerable history as a subject of historical research, a focus of nationalist discourse. In fact, failure itself is part of the way in which the South, the Confederacy, is memorialized. The whole idea of failure is central to the popular memory of what the Confederacy was. I had the chance to have a look at the Confederate Soldier Monument in Lake Eola Park. And if you look at the inscription on that monument, you get a very good sense of sometimes bizarre nature of popular memory when it comes to the Confederacy. Just quoting from the inscription, "The cause for which he suffered was lost," he being the Confederate soldier at the top of that plinth. "The people for whom he fought were crushed. The hopes in which he trusted were shattered." Now, this is not a monument to triumph by any stretch of the imagination, right? This is a monument to a loser nationalism, a serious loser nationalism. And why that happened and what it means for that to have happened is part of a very long and rich and deep historiography that if you're, for the students, if you're taking American history courses, you will no doubt have delved into. And what are the explanations? Well, they're myriad. Weaknesses of Southern industrial capacity, antiquated social hierarchies, inadequate supply chains, and then, of course, the inherent contradictions of a slave-based social and economic system that was seeking independence as part of its national goals. All of these things are part of the much plowed terrain of Southern history. The lost cause is critical. In fact, interestingly enough, it's not unique. The idea of national loss you find in lots of different national narratives around the world, and even in our own broader American history. Think of the Alamo, terrible loss, right? But remember the Alamo, what are you remembering? You're remembering a loser, right? What is Kosovo about? Kosovo in the Serb imagination is about loss. Great battle which was lost in the 14th century. From Alamo to Kosovo, one could find a whole variety of loser forms of nationalism. But the Confederate case, I think, in particular, raises a very searching question about what we might call the limits of constructedness. If we're all good kind of postmodernists and so on in the way that we approach the study of history, we know that everything is constructed, all the kind of social categories that we might believe in are constructed from nation to race to ethnicity to religion and so on. It's all a matter of social construction. But what are the limits of that? What are the limits beyond which it's difficult just to build anything out of thin air? What are the frontiers of the imagination, if you like, when it comes to what the nation is? And are all national narratives basically as good as any other one? That is, you can just invent anything when it comes to nationalism, and with enough time, enough power, you can get people to believe in just about anything. Is that really the case, or are there some inherent limits that we might want to consider? Well, in the case of the Confederacy, it seems to me there was a continual tension between two forms of the national idea. On the one hand, the nation, the Confederate nation, was conceived as deeply rooted in the unique traditions of a distinct society, a society that was continually, in the ideology of Confederate propagandists and intellectuals, counterpoised to that of the North. Well, what were some of those components? Religion and religiosity certainly played a role, as did traditions of chivalry and honor and rank. And what the precise dimensions of this identity were certainly occupied Confederate intellectuals for a good part of the brief existence of that nation state. But slavery, for many Confederate intellectuals and Confederate nationalists, certainly did play a powerful role. that lay at the base of this distinct society. Because in the minds of many Confederate intellectuals, it was the so-called peculiar institution that was seen to be fundamental and characterize, in fact, those mutually dependent relationships that were held to undergird Southern society as a whole. The master-slave nexus, with the former, the master, having a paternal regard, allegedly, for the well-being of the latter, who in turn owed obedience and contentment to the person who was in the more powerful position. This was seen as being a kind of microscopic version of the bonds of duty and obligation that were seen to be quintessential to Southern life in general. Moreover, slavery, even in the imagination of Confederate intellectuals themselves, provided the bedrock for an entire social and economic system that was believed to allow the so-called best men to devote their time to leadership, authority, and other kind of higher pursuits. So that if the North, in the Confederate imagination, was a land of greedy industrialists and radical abolitionists and white workers toiling for meager wages, then the South was a kind of idealized society of men and women of different ranks and different races, each very conscious of their predestined role in the harmonious social firmament. Some destined to be obedient servants, others destined to be wise stewards of the servants whom they had been allocated. That was one vision of what the South was, and it was a vision that, as I said, was counterpoised to a particular vision of what the North was supposed to be. On the other hand, Confederate nationalism had at its core a very different idea. The idea that there was an essential continuity between the ideas and values that had animated the struggle for American independence and the ideas and values that now underlay the desire for Confederate independence. The very system of government that had been put in place by the American Revolution was seen to be the predecessor of what the Confederates were all about, and threatened by the overweening power of the federal government in Washington. The events of 1861 were thus not seen as a departure from 1776, but the continuation of 1776. So two very different ideas at the core of Confederate ideology. But those differing ideas placed the idea of a Confederate nation in a peculiar bind. And a bind, in fact, that I think was probably not faced by nationalisms that had a more purely ethnic vision of what the nation was in European traditions. Confederate nationalism was a nationalism that sought the continued subjugation of a sizable part of its own population. But that population and its peculiar social status were nevertheless thought to be central to the national project. At the same time, the Confederacy found itself in a position of vying for a political and philosophical heritage that was also claimed by its chief opponent in this very brutal war. As the Confederate historian Drew Gilpin Faust, now president of Harvard, has reminded us, it was a movement of radical return, an ideology founded on recovering an allegedly foundational social hierarchy within a government that depended more and more on people, slaves, upland whites, and industrialists, who didn't share the essential values that Confederate intellectuals hoped that they would be able to recover. Few nationalisms in the world, I have to say, have put themselves in that difficult a position ideologically. All nationalisms have elements of contradiction to them, but few, I think, have faced those kind of self-imposed, convoluted, and contradictory aims that Confederate nationalism put before itself. That's the Confederacy. Mark Twain is reported to have remarked once that the chief cause of the Civil War was Sir Walter Scott. And by that he meant, of course, that the romantic imagery of Ivanhoe and other great works by Scott were part of the South's vision of itself. And of course, Confederate intellectuals and nationalists, the Southern public at large, were avid consumers of Scott's novels, the vision of chivalrous knights and demure but resourceful ladies, a hierarchical social order, fit very much with the Confederacy's own sense of who it was and its own sense of a kind of recoverable past that it was now in the business of trying to recover. Well, to many Scots today, I have to say, Walter Scott is, and really was even in his own lifetime, at best an oddity and at worst a kind of embarrassment. If you happen to travel to Edinburgh and see the monument to Scott's memory, it is now this blackened Gothic fantasy that rises up over the new town of Edinburgh, a monument that is monstrous sort of to look at and is a kind of fantasy monument to a writer that very few people even read anymore. Well, Scottish nationalism over the centuries has had a set of fortunes no less variable, I think, than that of Sir Walter Scott himself, who was one of the chief creators of a particular way of being Scottish. Why do I say variable? Well, because on the one hand, Scottishness comprises one of the most instantly recognizable sets of national elements in the world. Swinging kilts, skirling bagpipes, yipping terriers, tartan. You know Scottishness when you see it out in the world, and it's recognizable instantly, right? And you only need to go to a St. Andrew's Society dinner or a Burns Night supper or a Scottish Highland game somewhere to see Scottishness arrayed before you. Few nations, in fact, can claim that kind of element of instant recognition. What is Serbness to you? It's hard to say for most of us. Scottishness, I know, kilts and bagpipes and terriers, and tartan and so on. In fact, it's so successful as a set of national ideas that I think the Scots are probably one of the few nations who actually purchase their own tourist gear. You go to Scottish houses and you find, well, you have a terrier and you're wearing tartan and so on. Yet for most of the last 4 centuries, Scottish nationalism as a political project was a complete and utter failure. Indeed, Scottish nationalism, there's a great line from the Scottish journalist Andrew Marr, who says that Scottish nationalism has most often been reflected not in movements and demonstrations and calls to action, but what he calls, quote, sullenness and emptiness at the center of Scottish public life. And that's exactly right, that Scottish nationalism has been about being kind of sullen and being kind of depressed. That is the essence of Scottishness in many ways, has been over the last couple of centuries. Scottish crown was united with the crown of England in the early 17th century. The two parliaments, the Parliament of Scotland and the Parliament of what would eventually become Great Britain, were conjoined in 1707. Thereafter, there were periodic risings among the Scots that threatened the unity of the conjoined kingdom, but these were inevitably, I think, doomed affairs, led by one or another discontented claimant to the Scottish throne, often with French support. And the grievances, and intertwined with the grievances of what was quickly becoming a Catholic minority in an overwhelmingly Protestant state. The last major attempt at this, the very famous rising in 1745, led by Prince Charles Edward Stuart, ended at the famous Battle of Culloden in 1745, which was really the last military threat that the Scots ever presented to a united kingdom. Also another great defeat. So Alamo, Kosovo, Confederacy, Appomattox, Culloden, whole variety of emblems of failure with failed nationalisms of one sort or another. Well, Scotland's place in the United Kingdom was secured by a number of different things. First of all, there was the essential compromise in the early 18th century that allowed many basic Scottish institutions to remain in place. The church was still there, a separate Church of Scotland. A separate educational system was still there. A separate legal system was still there. And it's still the case in Scotland today. Even though the Parliament disappeared at the beginning of the 18th century, not to be resurrected until the end of the 20th, the basic institutions of Scottishness were very much in place. Secondly, over time, after the union of the early 18th century, the Scots managed to transform their elites from clan chiefs and Highland chieftains into essentially landlords, binding them to the broader system of British nobility and creating within the Highlands an incentive to move farmers and others who might have been the rabble that you would have pulled together for any successful nationalism off their lands. A period from the middle of the 18th century to the middle of the 19th century that is often known as the clearances with a capital C, the movement of small Scottish farmers and cattle drovers off their land. A movement of people that eventually produced, well, the Appalachians, that produced the Scottish immigrants coming to the mountainous region of the eastern United States. And then finally, the growth of the power of the lowlands over the highlands. The growth of the industrial base in what would be southern Scotland connected to the industrial base of northern England, around the wool industry and around the textile industry and so on, so that this entity was now bound into a United Kingdom in a much more fundamental way than it had ever been before. Well, this binding of Scotland into a United Kingdom, however, provided some space, some breathing room for the development, or the discovery, I should say, of Britain's own local savages. And that turned out to be the Scots, or at least an imagined view of the Scots. The great oddity of the 19th century, the century after the union of Scotland and England, the great oddity is that just as the economic power of Scotland was shifting to the south and the pull of England becoming stronger and stronger, the pull of England becoming stronger and stronger, a particular imagined, popularized image of what it meant to be Scottish could now come to the fore. The kilt, the bagpipe, the rather unkempt Highland cow, Highland games, and just about every other element of an allegedly timeless Scottish identity is a product of the 19th century, wholly manufactured in the 19th century by often English intellectuals and industrialists and others who had an incentive to create this image of a romantic, savage Highlander who had now been tamed by the beneficent power of the British state. Many of these things were also, and this is where the line about Sir Walter Scott may be actually correct, many of these things were also popularized by Walter Scott himself. King George IV, king of this united Great Britain, took a very famous visit to Edinburgh in the early 1820s. First time that in more than a century that a British king had ever visited Scotland. And this affair, which was completely orchestrated by Sir Walter Scott, was really quite magnificent. He had Highland chieftains standing on all the rocky cliffs around Edinburgh. He had tartan banners waving, bagpipes playing, people dressed in kilts, great assemblies of chieftains coming to pledge their loyalty to the king, coming down from the Highlands. All this was completely invented, of course. There were no Highlanders in that sense anymore. There were no clan chieftains in this sense anymore. And Walter Scott had put this on as the great sort of Scottish welcome to George IV, all the time knowing that, in fact, it was a complete invention. Scott's great biographer, J.G. Lockhart, who was also his son-in-law, was there to witness these events. And he said, quote, "So completely had this hallucination taken possession of everyone that nobody seems to have been startled at the time by language in a toast by the king himself, which conveyed his majesty's impression that the marking and crowning glory of Scotland consisted in the Highland clans and their chieftains." At one point during a dinner, George IV stands up and makes a toast to the clans and chieftains of Scotland. And everybody kind of embarrassedly looks around and realizes there's not a clan or a chieftain in the entire room, but they're all dressed up like them, right? And so the king himself had this vision that, this is what Scotland is. And that particular vision, of course, continued to inform popular views of what Scotland was throughout the 19th century. And then crowned by Queen Victoria's very famous interest in things Scottish, and in one particular Scot, her servant John Brown, who became very close to her later in life. Queen Victoria, a great fan of all of these things that we now think of as particularly Scottish, but were utterly inventions. When Scottish nationalism as a movement, however, begins to gain ground again, it's not until the 1960s, really. Late 1960s, for the very first time, the Scottish National Party wins a seat in the British Parliament. 1967 is the first time. Scottish National Party at that stage very much committed at some level to the idea of Scottish independence even. Scottish National Party is nothing about terriers and tartan. They have nothing to do with that. They're a vision of nationalism that rides on the back of the most radical labor movements of the 1960s and 1970s. By the time we get to the 1990s, and Tony Blair and the Labour Party in Britain, the party that has traditionally done very well in Scottish elections, begin to make their turn to the right, exactly like the Democratic Party does in this country in the Clinton administration, that frees up space for the Scottish National Party to take over the political space on the left that had been vacated by the traditional leftist party in Scotland. So that when we get around to the late 1990s, in 1997, when the people of Scotland vote in a referendum for restoring the Scottish Parliament, it's the Scottish National Party that by and large does very well out of that. And it's the Scottish National Party that now forms the local government in the newly reconstituted Scottish Parliament. What's the role of bagpipes in this, and tartans in this, and kilts in this, and Sir Walter Scott in this? Virtually zero. Right? Not in the way that Scottish nationalism portrays itself today, thinks about itself today. It's a kind of nationalism that's based on regionalism, the idea of Scotland as a place, as an inclusive kind of civic nationalism, social democracy at its core, and the role of the state in providing education and social services and so on. That's what Scottish nationalism is today, not the failed variety that Sir Walter Scott tried to recreate in the 1820s. In fact, I'm wearing my Scottish Parliament tie. You don't see any tartan on the tie. It's not tartan at all, but that's the basic idea. They said, I asked why it was purple last time I was in the Scottish Parliament last year, and they said, well, that's the color of heather. And you know, they're sort of right, I guess. That's the color of the heather on the hills, blooming all over Scotland in the summer. Last nationalism I want to deal with. If you were to have traveled to the southern reaches of the Russian Empire in the 19th century, you might well have heard a Scottish accent on occasion. You might have heard it lilting over the Eurasian steppe or echoing across the Caucasus Mountains. And if you were a traveler in the early part of the 19th century, it might have belonged to a guy who would have been introduced to you as John Abercrombie. Excellent Scottish name, John Abercrombie. And if you appealed to John Abercrombie, he could have found for you a place to stay. He could have made introductions to local officials. He could have given you horses or a carriage for passage across the sometimes hostile steppe. And he was known to speak with a very thick accent. The odd thing about John Abercrombie is that he wasn't Scottish at all. He was a member of a group called the Circassians. In local language, they're called the Adiga, the Circassians of the Northwest Caucasus, the indigenous ethnic group in that southern part of the old Russian Empire, now the southern part of the Russian Federation. Why did he have a thick Scottish brogue? Well, it turns out that there were Scottish missionaries who lived in his part of then the Russian Empire, and rather than being sort of economical Scots, I suppose, they discovered that the easiest way to win souls of young children was simply to buy those children from their parents. And Scottish missionary organizations ended up spending a fair amount of money buying children, essentially, from upland Circassian parents and then raising them in Scottish missionary homes in the lowlands of the southern Russian Empire. Changed their names to things like John Abercrombie and McClellan and McCain and things of that nature. And then taking on much of the symbolism and the speech patterns of local Scots. We know of this guy, John Abercrombie. He's not particularly famous today. Who's ever heard of John Abercrombie? But we know about him because about half a dozen travelers to the Russian Empire in the 19th century, in writing their tales of traveling through southern Russia, mention him. And because he's the local fixer. You know, if you need a place to stay, they say, go ask John Abercrombie. He was a member, as I said, of this ethnic group called the Circassians, a group that's sort of largely forgotten in the West today, but in Abercrombie's day, they were of considerable interest to West European strategists, even to Americans in a way, because something called the Circassian question, which was the desire by many Circassian communities to become independent and to spend a great deal of time fighting for their independence against the Russian Empire, was one of the most vexed questions of international diplomacy in the first half of the 19th century. Correspondents from major newspapers, the Times of London, for example, traveled to Circassia to interview leaders of the insurrection there. British spies were sent to Circassia to try to foment a rebellion against the Russian Empire at the time when Russia and Britain were competing for influence in Central Asia and the Indian subcontinent and elsewhere. Even the Circassian national flag, which is a kind of green flag with some arrows crossed on it and a bunch of stars above the arrows, which if you go to Paterson, New Jersey, you'll certainly see. There's a rather large Circassian community there. Even that flag itself was the design of a foreigner. It wasn't designed by the Circassians themselves. It turns out it was designed by yet another Scot, but I won't go into that particular story. Circassians were well known in the 19th century. Your great-great-great-grandparents probably would have known the term Circassian. They would have certainly have heard it. All of these efforts, however, Circassians want their independence, the British want to support them, really came to very little. Circassian nationalism ultimately failed. And looking back on its failure in the latter part of the 19th century, two Circassian chieftains wrote a personal letter to Queen Victoria when they were sort of complaining about the lack of British support for their national cause. And they said, "In the past, we have been accused of the Allied powers of want of sincerity, not having participated with them against our common foe during the Crimean War. This is true," they said, "but it was not the fault of our nation, as it proceeded from want of union and energy between our leaders." They could just never get it together. The national cause just never really panned out. Well, the failure of Circassian nationalism had implications for the Circassians themselves, because they were the victims of what I think in today's language we would certainly call ethnic cleansing, perhaps even genocide. From 1860 to 1864, there was a mass movement of Circassians out of the northwestern Caucasus before Russian troops who were sent into villages and valleys and mountainsides to clear them out. Much of the Northwest Caucasus was virtually emptied of indigenous villagers. Crops were burned, houses destroyed, columns of displaced persons marching to the seacoast where they were put on ships and then sent across the Black Sea to the Ottoman Empire, which had agreed to take them and then resettle them in other parts of what is today Turkey. But Circassian nationalism as an idea, it turns out, had legs. That is, the expulsions of the 1860s left plenty of Circassians dead. That's certainly true. But it also created this new vast diaspora, now spread across the Middle East, in Turkey, in Jordan, other parts of the Middle East, and in far-flung places like Paterson, New Jersey, as I said earlier. And in these diaspora centers, intellectuals really nourished the ideas of unity and independence and a common cultural heritage that they had never managed to fuse into a nationalism earlier in the 19th century. The expulsions of the 1860s became the Alamo. It became the Culloden. It became the Appomattox, this great experience of loss and suffering. That became, for Circassian intellectuals, the key nodal point around which the idea of Circassianness and Circassian identity could now revolve. Circassian nationalism as a political project, however, continued to fail throughout the rest of the 19th century and throughout the 20th century. Circassians rose again, very briefly, in 1917, at the time of the Russian Revolution. But the Circassian population in its old homeland failed to follow the call to arms that many of their intellectuals had put forward. Circassia became part of the Soviet Union, and within the Soviet Union itself, Circassian identity was reduced really to, pardon me, I'm going to cough, was reduced essentially to the idea of a particular dance troupe or other forms of nationality that were thought to be less serious than the idea of taking up guns against the Russian oppressor. Don't mind if I put in a cough drop. So when the Soviet Union collapsed, though, in 1991, the Circassians made still further rumblings about renewing their old struggle, take up arms against the Russians as had happened in the past, but few had stomach for a real fight anymore. However, the idea of immigration, the idea of the expulsions of the 1860s continued to animate Circassians, continues to animate them today. And one need only go to Amman, Jordan, or Paterson, New Jersey again to find the idea of Circassianness to be very profound and very real, even if the political project of creating an independent Circassia has failed. Well, where does all of this leave us then? Where does this leave us? These three nationalisms, Confederates, Scots, Circassians, were failures certainly, but failures of a particular sort. The Confederates failed to create a lasting independent state. Thank you very much. That's great. Excellent. The failure of my voice in addition to failure of nationalism. Thank you. Circassians failed terribly. The Confederates failed terribly. The Scots, in various ways, failed terribly. But a sense of Southern identity is still there. Sometimes comes out in odd and unpredictable ways. I was in Bristol, Tennessee, not too long ago on a trip. I was telling some of you earlier today. Traveling through Bristol, Tennessee with my girlfriend, who on a Saturday morning wanted a bagel. And I sort of said, well, I thought in Bristol, Tennessee, it might be hard to find a bagel on Saturday morning. And we went downtown and sure enough, came across a bagelry run by Jews for Jesus with a sign on the door that said, "Shalom, y'all." So I thought Southernness and the idea of being Southern can be transmogrified and changed in kind of odd and interesting ways. Scottish nationalism, as we think of it today, is the product of a largely English and largely Victorian fascination with the Highland savage, the noble Highland savage, but which became then grafted onto labor movements of the 1960s and 1970s and is now nurtured by, in many ways, the European Union. It's safe to be a Scottish nationalist today. The idea is that you could exit Britain, but you'd still be part of the European Union, and presumably at some stage have the same currency, the euro, as many other parts of the Union have. People could travel freely between Scotland and Britain. You wouldn't have customs posts or border checkpoints or anything like that. It's safe to be a Scottish nationalist in the way that it wasn't in the past. Circassian nationalism has likewise had its ups and downs, failing in the 1860s with the expulsion of the Circassians from the Russian Empire, yet succeeding as a sense of identity among a global diaspora and among a globally aware diaspora. Where then does all of this kind of stuff leave us? Well, I want to leave you with what I think are some of the lessons, both for historians and others, when it comes to thinking about nationalism. And let me point to just three things briefly. First of all, thinking about failure helps us focus attention on the causes of nationalism. Understanding why particular nationalisms succeed and others fail, why they succeed in certain ways at certain times and fail in certain ways at certain times, helps us focus our attention on the why of nationalism. It's very often the case that when we look at nationalist movements around the world, believe the basic ideology of nationalists themselves. Why did Muslims and Christians, Serbs and Croats and Bosnians come to blows in Yugoslavia in the 1990s? Well, it's obvious, we might say. Ancient hatreds, age-old animosities. These people have been fighting for 1,000 years, as Bill Clinton said at one stage. I don't think there were Croats and Serbs 1,000 years ago, but anyway. We often believe the very language that the nationalists themselves are trying to impose on their populations and on us. Thinking about failure is part of what being a good historian is, I think. Thinking about contingency and the ways in which the world could have been otherwise than it is. It helps us focus on the causes, on causality. Secondly, it pushes us toward thinking about alternative poles of allegiance. Part of the idea of nationalism, as I said at the very beginning of the talk, is the belief that you are born into a nation, you have a national identity, you should have some allegiance to your national identity, and if you don't, you're not a good fill in the blank, Pole, Serb, whatever. But focusing on the idea of failure, I think, helps us understand periods in which actually the nation didn't matter very much at all. It was your village that mattered, or your clan that mattered. Your basic sense of identity came from your sense of your lineage, your heritage, not your national background. National groups don't always exist where we think they should, and they sometimes exist where we don't expect them to. Thinking about failure helps us sort that out. Finally, thinking about failure helps us to sort out nationalism into its component parts. There are nationalist ideologies, there are nationalisms as social movements. Nationalism can be a form of building a state or building a country. And nationalism can sometimes be about trying to get international recognition for the state that you have created. Nationalism has lots of different components to it. What frequently happens when scholars write about nationalism is that they believe that they're talking about all of those things at the same time when they're really talking about one tiny part of it. Thinking about failure can help us sort out the various components of nationalism and deal with each one of those in a more sophisticated way. In the end, studying failure is not a very exciting business. It can be also often quite a depressing business. Loser nationalisms involve a whole set of stories that are, at best, melancholic, have sort of melancholic endings to them. You only need, again, go to the Confederate Memorial in Lake Eola Park and be a little melancholy in a way. Simply at the inscription there, not for the failure of the Confederacy by any means, but by the nature of the inscription written there. It's about loss and failure, and one doesn't want to spend a lot of time reading it and looking at it. It can even have grotesque endings, as in the case of the Circassians and their tragic expulsion from the Russian Empire. But failure is part of the story of nationalism in the modern age. And it also, I think, tells us that nationalism and nations are not something inevitable. They happen at particular times, they're created in particular ways, they succeed or fail for particular reasons. And part of what it means to be a good historian or analyst of international affairs is to try to figure out under what circumstances does the sight of some kind of colored banner waving in the breeze excite people to cheer and jeer and cry and eventually die for that thing? And in what circumstances doesn't it? Thank you very much.